Hello, 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 everybody. Thank you so much for joining me. I am Michelle Hayward. It is great to be here today. Um, I wanted to come on and talk about the new ISO DNI standard that was released in May of 2021. And in doing so, I think I'm having some technical issues. Give me 1 second. Let me see if I can get this worked out. Okay. Okay. I think we're good now. All right. Cool. So we should be okay now. I see there was a slight delay. So I wanted to say thanks everybody for joining. It is actually a great day to talk about this because over the last 2 years, we've seen a lot of organizations talk about the changes they wanted to make for their Black employees, Black community overall. But what does that look like? How do we literally, not just here in the US, but globally, look inside our organizations, determine what work needs to be done, and deploy that? And that's been a huge question that has, or obstacles and questions that organizations have gone back and forth. And during the Equity Pursuit series, what we're talking about are actionable steps organizations can take, their actual management teams, the leaders in their organizations who are often white, and the steps they can literally take. One of the things I wanted to talk about was really that new ISO standard. A lot of organizations are well versed with it, they're familiar with it, it's been around for a long time. So I'm saying ISO. So if you're not familiar with the International Organization of Standards, when I say ISO, I'm saying the letters ISO, even though it says International Organization of Standards. And when I say this, a lot of organizations are familiar with it because ISO creates a standard procedure and practices for nearly between 160, 170 countries, not companies, countries. Yes, and that's why it's international. And organizations have typically used ISO more in manufacturing, in IT, in medical, even in construction, where I come out of in civil engineering. But this is the first time that we've seen it being done for diversity and inclusion. So it does say DNI. And this process literally started 10 years ago or 11 years ago now to actually have a standard created for diversity and inclusion. And 10 years into working, and people are like, oh, they must have started this after the murder of George Floyd. No, it actually started prior to that because there was a commitment of HR professionals who really wanted to see a standard created so organizations had a guideline to go by because oftentimes they had more questions. They didn't want to fund, getting funded for it, which we'll talk about that next week. Um, or rather in 2 weeks. What is that like, and how do we get across these barriers? And so we look at ISO and what it does overall. When we're talking about what are the benefits for ISO overall, it literally identifies risks and opportunities in our organizations. And people's like, well, DNI does diversity and inclusion. People feel better. And organizations like, well, how do we measure that? And there's some things organizations do on the HR side as well, for employee engagement to try to see how their employees are feeling. But what are the risks right now in the great, what they're calling the great migration, the great reset, just people quitting their jobs? That risk hasn't been unknown in organizations. It just hasn't been felt as strongly. And so, what are the opportunities that this ISO standard or ISO brings out in organizations or identifies in organizations? It also generally helps prevent problems from reoccurring, right? Do you want to go through this again? It can boost your marketing and sales efforts. It improves employee performance, and it can improve your overall business. So there are a lot of benefits that different parts of ISO, different standards rather of ISO, bring out in organizations that are often really, really praised upon and important. And so I encourage you to really think about what are some benefits of having DNI in your organization, right? So then you're looking at the certification, um, and are you going to see organizations often look at improved customer satisfaction, international recognition because of your ISO certification, define processes, reduce costs. Imagine if organizations could reduce the cost to replace one employee. That would be huge for some organizations, many of them right now. More businesses, different markets you could target because you can identify, remember, the opportunities you have, as well as the risks in your organizations. And more consistent quality are some of the benefits when you're looking at what many of us are familiar with when it comes to ISO. But when we look at it from the DEI perspective, we may come across some other benefits. And I know ISO for larger organizations are very popular, very well known, but there are often benefits for smaller organizations to actually invest, at least in getting an audit and recommendations, so you understand where you stand. So your customers can feel confident sometimes because you have an ISO certification. Um, you can meet regulation requirements. Oftentimes, when we're looking at IT and different quality, whether it's 9,000, 14,000, and so forth, ISO, um, reduce costs again, and really gain market access because a lot of organizations highly regard and respect ISO. And so it's really so many different ways. Though the new thing about this ISO DNI um, certification, while it's not mandatory right now, a lot of organizations are predicting it may be mandatory and may become a requirement for organizations long term. And so it's really important that we look at and see, do we want to start this practice now? What is truly different about the current or different about this DNI policy is that it doesn't focus simply on HR. You're like, what are you talking about? It doesn't focus on diversity, supplier diversity. It literally does what ISO does. It looks at the impact of diversity and inclusion throughout an organization. And you're like, wait, that's a little bit different. Exactly. And so you have so many different opportunities to really go through your organization doing an audit. And usually, doing an audit, what organizations are going through is only in their HR, right? They're looking at their recruitment, they're looking at retention, they're looking at the workplace. They may pull in analytics, but they really aren't touching on the other aspects of their business. They really aren't focused on what does it look like for governance. Who is really going to run this part of the org? Who's going to be accountable for this work in the organization? So ISO does bring out other parts of the organization to really focus on that are often overlooked and completely ignored. And I think it's really important when you look at the new ISO, which is ISO 30415. So I'm going to say 3415. So bear with me because that's what I call it. But it's really important to know and understand what is going on, what practices you can have when it comes to ISO in your organization. It doesn't have to be um, in all to be all for your organization. You literally could go through ISO and an audit and find out, okay, maybe you're doing okay in the recruitment side of your business. But when you're looking at other aspects of it, other parts of the new ISO, you may find out that You may be lacking in inclusive culture. Maybe your procurement and supplier diversity isn't as great as you thought. Organizational leadership, you don't have the buy-in you need, and really taking focus on where you have gaps throughout the organization. And so it's not it's an all-encompassing viewpoint of your organization. And what I mean by that, you're even going to look at supply chain, governance, and product delivery in this ISO 30415 or ISO 3415. You're going to look at your organizational stakeholders, designated responsibilities for getting this work done in your organization. And so it digs in deeper than what we've seen some other frameworks, or really where we're seeing some really great JEDI, DEI, and J or DEI B consultants go and try to go into organizations and really set this up. Where an ISO is building it out up front, but there's still some gaps in there. And what I mean by gaps is an audit. And with that audit, you're going to get recommendations. And so it doesn't tell you, as ISO does, what your next steps are. Because during that audit, and you're getting those recommendations, you may find that you have to now create and change processes in HR. Maybe you're not collecting data a certain way. Maybe data privacy isn't set up correctly. Um, Maybe the way you're analyzing your people data or HR analytics. You have some methodologies. Maybe you aren't analyzing the data at all to really understand what's going on. And then it moves out and look at your product development and delivery, right? How does DNI impact that? Because companies are spending $600 million in the US just for DNI. And that's a huge amount of money. And so if you can change that and really navigate that money into different areas of the business to drive diversity and inclusion, even in your procurement and supplier diversity, um, which is often one of the other areas we talk most about, diversity and inclusion, but really look at individual responsibilities in the organization, who's delegated responsibilities, organizational leadership. And that's the one thing that I like about the new process or the new ISO 3415 standard is the governance body that it includes, because oftentimes it falls on DNI or the chief diversity officer, who oftentimes is under resourced, does not have the authority and power to make the changes. And until that changes, right, you are looking at very little to no sustainable change for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in the workplace. So the gaps can be great and the gaps can be small, but it's really important to understand what those gaps are, where they're coming from, and how do you go about in changing those. Okay. So what I really want us to talk about even more is understanding that the ISO 3415 looks at the types of diversity. So they've identified 27 types of diversity. Those may change. You may find that you focus on some at certain phases of your DNI journey, others a little bit later. Sometimes you don't know where to start until you do the ISO audit, and what policies that you need to create and design. But it really helps you start the process of understanding the gaps, not in HR. That DNI gets so focused on HR, but it's really an organizational impact. And that's really the power of having this ISO 3415 is understanding where it goes, how it drives down throughout the organization on every level. And we don't often see that. When we think about a few years ago, not that many, probably about three to four, about lawsuits at General Motors with Black employees encountering racism, and how these Black employees were on the manufacturing floor. It's often seen as then what? An HR issue. But what is the impact of the culture in the organization? What is the impact of manufacturing products on the floor, right? What is the impact then on your customer receiving a quality product? And we don't often look at it that way. But when you think about how D&I drives throughout the organization, its impact on your people, your talent, then you have to go through and look at, well, this employee that was encountering racism wasn't able to do their job effectively and efficiently, right? Then you weren't able to produce a quality product that was then purchased. And now you have customers coming back to the dealership with manufacturing issues and you having recalls. And so it is an impact on that individual customer because of the issues of diversity and inclusion in your workplace. And we don't ever really talk about that on that level. But this ISO standard gives us the opportunity to really dial in and understand how much is being and who is being impacted at what level. And you're like, but how about supply chain? They aren't able to manufacture and make things, deliver products, order products, check the status of products, which is not an environment that is really diversity, equity, inclusion focused. And so being able to see these other areas of impact, right? In healthcare, just like, well, our policy is X, Y, and Z when it comes to patients. And you will find so many discriminatory practices even in healthcare, right? So understanding the overall impact of D&I in your organization is one thing I really do like about this current policy because it doesn't just drive it and shrink it into HR. It is an overall impact on your organization, and we can't. It's past the time to ignore what that looks like. Now, when we also think about the new ISO standard, they're looking at 170 risk elements. Yes, 170. I don't know. 170 seems maybe like a lot, maybe not like we can have 170 in just HR. That's true. And a lot of the what I don't like about the current ISO, a lot of it is still HR focused and driven because that's where it is human resources, right? But I think we need to focus also on the governance part more because that is truly how we're going to manage this, who's responsible for it. And it really, that's where we're seeing a lot. We're hearing a lot of talk, but we're not seeing a lot of action. And I know certain things do take time, but you also need to be communicating with people. And then we aren't seeing a lot of individual responsibility in organizations. And so I think the one thing I don't like is still how HR driven it is. And part of the problem could be is at this point, a lot of organizations don't understand the impact and importance of D&I throughout their entire organization, whether it's supply chain or product delivery. And they really, really should. And that's why we really need to delve in deeper into this. Now, like I said, one of the downsides I think of this ISO 3415 is that it's not mandatory yet, but it is global. This is being used globally. Again, you're talking about Ireland and other countries already investing in undertaking this work. You're talking about France, a lot of European countries already doing this work. So there are other people internationally outside of the U.S. dialing in on this, understanding the power and importance of it, but it is not mandatory. And I know it was like, well, it shouldn't be. I think at least an audit should be, so organizations can understand what I would like to see, hopefully, is more stakeholders, right? Requiring organizations to do an audit, to see what recommendations they get, to have their people trained. And that's part of the gap that I would say we have right now. And we're really working to change that. And it's one organization at a time. I would say the other downside of ISO is a lot of nonprofits, many small, medium sized businesses don't necessarily invest in it. Number one, they think it's an overall cost, that the cost may seem like a lot for them. And what I often say is, what's the overall value? If you're able to then be able to retain your talent, train your talent, grow your market share, have better quality products, it is truly an overall investment in your organization. And that audit can help bring out some of those recommendations on how do you hit some of those things a little bit sooner, so you can generate revenue to continue to hit things, to grow and improve your D&I programs long term. And if you think about it that way, and you figure out how over time, maybe 2 to 5 years, to build in the expense or the cost of ISO in your organization, it really helps you then understand the value. And I don't think ISO, I don't think it ever does, but I think with this new DNI one, it's not a lot of discussion around that, or especially for small to medium sized businesses. And people are often like, well, why would you worry about small to medium sized businesses? What a lot of people don't know, most employ most people work at small and medium sized companies. They do not work in Fortune 500s in these large companies, even though they may have thousands of people. Most of us are employed by small, medium sized businesses. And them having this value add of ISO 3415 can also help them grow and retain talent. It can also help them improve their products and services. But that's often not focused on, and it may give them an opportunity to draw new clients, right? Because remember, when you go through the audit, it looks at your risk and your opportunities. So identifying risk in your organization, in your business that you didn't know were there, but also opportunities, which could vary, really are to the benefit of small businesses. And so I think the way we've always thought about ISO, especially if you come out of manufacturing, engineering, construction, IT, medical, it's not always about the overall long term impact of the org outside of that product or service you delivery. But we really need to see that when it comes to D&I. So that's what I wanted to share. I'll drop in a link where you can go to ISO's website. You can check out ISO 3415, read it for yourself. I really think it's really interesting. They even included some of the UN sustainability information. So they have 3 policies they're focused on in just that, in just the UN sustainable development goals. So they included gender equity, decent work and economic growth is included, industry innovation and infrastructures in there. Oh yeah, and reduce inequality. And so I think it's really interesting how these were pulled into. So if you don't ever follow the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, definitely check it out. I probably look at it 2 to 3 times a year. Not that it changes often, but just to see what other people are developing and how they're trying to solve problems like reducing equity, gender equality, 2 things that we focus on here at Positive Hire, decent work and economic growth. We also focus on that. What are other people doing? What solutions have they come up with, and ideas are being generated around it? And so I like that ISO 3415 is focused on these 2 to really close those gaps and make changes when it comes to these UN sustainable development goals. So I'm going to stop there. I'm really excited about it, but I do understand there's still some gaps in there. There's still opportunity, whether it comes to organizations not collecting data, organizations not analyzing data, organizations not understanding the overall impact of D&I outside of human resources. And I think it will start to shine a light on some of those gaps we are seeing right now in organizations. So definitely excited about it. So everybody, I will be back in 2 weeks. We will be talking about then um, your DNI dollars, why they don't make sense. Yes, and where to find the money to pay for your DNI, um, as well as how do you find the right DNI consultant for you and your business. And we know the struggles are wide and they vary, but we definitely want to talk about it. And I will have two guests on to talk about it then. So have a great day, everybody, and I will talk to you later.